All right. So, learning disabilities. Let's start with that broad category. Let's start by exploring some terms. A strategy. A strategy is something you do on purpose in order to get through a task. So let me ask you if you can picture your morning routine. What strategies do you use to keep yourself on track? How do you make sure you're going to get out of the door on time? Think about a few. You got it? Did you learn these on purpose? Or did you pick them up somewhere? You might have just picked it up somewhere. Or you may have done it accidentally once and realized it works. So you kept doing it on purpose over and over again. For me, for example, a strategy is to put the timer on my coffee machine so that when I wake up, the smell of coffee gets me out of bed. Now, let's talk about metacognition. This is the ability to recognize those strategies and to choose them when we need them. So think about your morning strategies. Now wake up in a hotel. How many of those still work? How many might need to be adjusted? How many do you have to just throw out? Because I can't set my coffee maker the night before in a hotel, can I? I'd like to share a rather long quote with you, but I think it's a really important one. This is a paradigm shift in how we think about learning disabilities. I'm going to read it out loud verbatim. The older idea that some deficiency in one or more of the basic components of cognitive processing causes disabilities has given way to the current view that inefficiency rather than deficiency most accurately characterizes the problems experienced by students with learning disabilities. In other words, while students with learning disabilities possess the necessary cognitive tools to effectively process information, for some reason they do so inefficiently. Most researchers suspect that that breakdown occurs in the domain of strategic processing and metacognition. So what do we know about students with learning disabilities? They don't have an array of strategies, whereas we often picked them up and realized, hey, this works. I'm going to do this again on purpose. Our students who have learning disabilities need to have these strategies taught explicitly. In addition, what strategies they have, they don't know how to select which strategy for a problem. So even if we've taught those strategies, they often only use them in the narrow circumstances in which they learned that strategy. They don't generalize to new and novel situations easily. So that's a learning disability. It's what we call a high incidence disability, meaning that there's as many kids with a learning disability as all the other categories combined. Where do disabilities hit, learning disabilities? As you can see from this chart, reading is highly affected. Number 2 is math. You can see why we focus.
Vnaessa, the interpreter is asking you 1 second while JC looks at the graph. Thank you.
Sure. You can see why we focus so much effort on literacy in schools. All right, so what is a reading disability? This is a big category, and what we can say is that the cause may vary. It may be an area of difficulty in comprehension or in phonics. It could be a difficulty in vocabulary acquisition. We don't know why a child may have a reading disability. It may be caused by low school exposure, that perhaps they're a student who's had to change schools, Or perhaps they're a student who's in the same school, but the school hasn't had a consistent teacher for that class. So they've had a series of rotating long-term subs, right? So school exposure can cause reading difficulties. We see with our kids who struggle with reading, a chicken and the egg connection. They struggle with reading, so they don't enjoy it. They don't enjoy it, so they do it less. What's critical about reading disabilities, the general category, is that we can tell what the cause is by how well a student responds to intervention. So if we have a child who's had low school exposure, but we give them intensive intervention for a period of time and things get better, then we know that the cause in that case was low school exposure. A little bit more about reading disability. I'm going to just give you a minute to read the slide. So as I mentioned on the last slide, a reading disability, the general category, this umbrella category, can be in any area of reading. We most often see them in the phonological processing of a student's reading, but we also see it in comprehension, and that includes vocabulary. A reading disability can situate in any area of reading. The idea of trying to figure out what area of reading a child is struggling with helps us ultimately design intervention. So this is a model we use in special education. It's called the simple view of reading. What's important here is to notice that it's multiplicative, not additive. It's multiplication. So R is reading, D is decoding, LC is listening comprehension. Now go back to your math. If D is 0, what is reading? If comprehension is 0, what is overall reading? That means we need to be concerned with both. Per this model, we divide struggling readers, into a couple of different categories. If they're struggling primarily with decoding, phonics, phonological awareness, we might say that a student is probable for dyslexia. If a student is struggling with comprehension or vocabulary, we say that they might be they are a potential candidate for hyperlexia. And then we have students who are struggling in both categories. When we translate this into what we do in the classroom, it kind of looks like this. For students who are struggling with decoding or potentially have dyslexia, we're going to work on phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. For students who are struggling in comprehension, we're going to work with vocabulary development, comprehension, and guess what? Also fluency. Fluency is the bridge between decoding and comprehension. You have to read accurately and with expression in order to understand what you're reading. So let's look at what this looks like over the age span. For very young children, we might first see difficulties with speech sounds. As they get a little bit older and we introduce those letters, they may have difficulty connecting sounds with letters. They may be very slow in reading, their pace laborious. They may read word by word. They haven't had a ton of practice. So I want you to remember again, that chicken and the egg. A student is struggling, they don't like to read, so they avoid it. And the less they read, the further they fall behind. We're going to see that particularly in vocabulary growth. And I don't have a slide for it, but you guys may have discussed the Matthew effects. The idea that vocabulary growth becomes inhibited when students are not reading, and that gap grows over time. They might have difficulty understanding what they read. They might avoid reading. This is my favorite analogy. My class has heard this. I apologize. But I want you for just a moment to picture yourself at your workplace in your bathing suit. Everyone else gets to wear clothes, but you have to work all day in your bathing suit. How does that feel? That's equivalent to how some of our older struggling readers feel about being called on in class. Like they're in their bathing suit and everyone else gets to wear clothes. So now let's move into dyslexia. This is a type of reading disability. This one very specifically has a neurobiologic component. This specifically demonstrates as a delay or difficulty in phonological processing. They have difficulty at the word level, recognition of individual words, decoding strategies for words, and reading phrased in a way that the words string together as opposed to word by word. Just a little bit more on this. Some of the things we might see in a child with dyslexia are listed below. So just take a moment and picture what each of those might look like in a classroom. Can you see where a teacher would have an opportunity to experience and see where their child is struggling, so that they can begin that identification process and we can get children help? Another way to think of dyslexia is to think about the word itself. Dys means difficulty. Lexia means word. We're breaking the code of the word, and we're using words in order to derive meaning. So when we think about this idea of breaking the code, it really helps us understand how a teacher needs to teach differently for a child with dyslexia. We need that code emphasis. It is based on phonics. We need to make sure students have foundational skills such as phonemic awareness. We work on fluency. Code emphasis instruction is teacher driven. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the teacher's feedback is corrective. If we find an error, we stop them, we provide the correct answer, and we have them repeat it back to us. Generally speaking, I say 3 times. So let's talk a little bit about outcomes. I thought I would start this with the good news. Navigating life successfully with dyslexia is possible. We have lots of models for it. As it turns out, there are some real strengths that accompany having dyslexia. So while you may be struggling coding words, you have other strengths that really shine, and I think that serve people with dyslexia lifelong very well. So let's talk about some of these. Children with dyslexia, people with dyslexia tend to see the big picture, right? You've heard the expression seeing the trees through the forest. They may miss the trees, they might, but they see the forest. They get the large idea. They tend to sort of find the unusual valuable. So they might be that person in your class or that person in your life who's drawn to those parts of you that are a little less typical. They may find those parts of you that they like, that other people may not appreciate. They have improved patterns of recognition. And this one is kind of common sense. If they don't have a lot of decoding strategies, they're memorizing whole words. It's one of the reasons reading can be so laborious for people with dyslexia. But that also means they've highly developed a skill that the rest of us have not. Good spatial knowledge, awareness of space, awareness of time. So, my example is not being able to find my car at the mall parking lot. I have poor spatial skills. They're picture thinkers. They can visualize. Sharper peripheral vision. That one was brand new to me today. I'd never heard that before, but I guess it makes sense. Business entrepreneurs, out of the box thinking, right? Really having a certain willingness to take risks and thinking about things creatively, highly creative, having to come up with alternative solutions to problems that many of us take for granted, being able to just move through it quickly. And finally, divergent thinking about things from a new angle, thinking about things in a way that a lot of us don't. Now, the not so good news. Adults with dyslexia and reading disabilities are disproportionately imprisoned. They disproportionately live in poverty. They disproportionately drop out of school. And they disproportionately both enter and complete college. So even when they go to a 4-year university or 2-year community college, they often don't finish. In fact, 58% of adults who self-reported having a learning disability lacked the basic functional reading and writing skills needed to work. Many of these adults didn't graduate high school. So in addition to a dearth of skills, they also don't have the diploma to even get the interview. So let's talk about some good news. What can we do, right? First, I just wanted you to be aware of how we do some assessment. This first slide is the special ed side. So for our elementary ed colleagues tonight, you won't be asked to do this, but I did just want to give you a little background. Now, I'll be honest, I teach a whole class on this slide, so I'm not going into depth. But for learning disabilities in general, we have 2 different methods for identification for special education. The first one is response to intervention, or RTI. And what that means is that we have an increasing level of intensity of intervention. If a student responds to that intervention, we can kind of rule out if there's a neurological component. We can say that intervention works. So they may not have a disability, but rather have other factors interfering with their learning or their ability to show us what they have learned. The other model is called the discrepancy model. This one's been around since the dawn of time. In this model, we give a student 2 different tests, an achievement test. An example would be the Woodcock-Johnson. And we give them a cognitive or IQ test. An example would be the WASI. We compare those scores. IQ is a predictor for achievement. So if there's a big gap between what we would predict their achievement to be using their cognition scores and what their actual achievement turns out to be on something like the Woodcock-Johnson, we would say that's likely a learning disability. For dyslexia specifically, we look at this in those areas of need. We look at things using dibbles, for example. What's their phonemic awareness like? Their blending, their segmenting. How are their phonics or accuracy of reading real words? What about word attack? What happens when we present them with a nonsense word? Can they apply decoding rules? And then finally, oral reading, having them read aloud so we can assess both accuracy and pace. And then we may use a secondary measure like Gray's oral reading is an example. And there are others, but it includes a miscue analysis, much like the BRI or QRI that you're learning in your classes now. But let's talk about what general and special education teachers can do together. The first thing that we do when we notice that a child is struggling is we refer them to a school-based team called an SST, or a student study team. This is a group on your campus that may include lots of people. It should include general educators. It may include special educators. It should include an administrator. And the children's names who are brought to this group are discussed. Recommendations are made for the general education teacher for adaptations and accommodations to be made in her class in the general education setting. We try everything we can before we make a referral to special education. The SST's most important function is to keep kids in the general education. It's not to be viewed as a gateway to special ed. We hope to resolve most issues before we get to that. So, what are we looking for? Depends on the age. For preschoolers, we might be looking at their ability to learn the alphabet, to understand rhyming patterns, and to look at their pronunciation of words. Grade schoolers, are they reading slower than their classmates? Do they have trouble separating certain letters? And the very common ones are B and D, make your bed, right? They may struggle because they don't have all of the word sounds. They don't necessarily connect the words to phonics, understanding that when you put these two letters together, it makes a brand new sound. They may struggle to follow directions or misspell easy words, and they may write laboriously. And then for older kids, a lot of times we see this in their handwriting. They take a long time to finish tasks. That may be particularly true for tasks that have multiple steps of directions. They might write or speak slowly. They don't want to read aloud because, guys, they're wearing a bathing suit, okay? They may use the wrong words, and they may use a lot of fillers. I want to introduce you to a teaching tool, which again, tonight, I'm just touching upon, and it's called structured literacy. The idea here is that there are programs that are very good and that are often used in general education classrooms. They're balanced programs, meaning they're trying to hit all areas of literacy. These are not sufficiently intensive for students with dyslexia. They specifically need targeted intervention for decoding, for phonics, for phonological processes. And an answer to that is structured literacy. This is a system in which we use direct instruction. It's teacher-led. We teach explicitly with guided practice and independent practice. Pretty familiar sounding. We have at the end of this presentation a folder for you with resources, and I put a lot more about structured literacy in the resources folder for you. I was just a little too worried about it eating the entire presentation tonight. So, how can you, general and special educators, help yourself, help each other? There's a few different models. You may have a push-in model where the special educator joins the general education class. The special education teacher is working with groups within that class. Those groups do not need to only be students with IEPs. They can be any student in the class who's struggling with the target skill, that special educator is working on that day. I, in fact, encourage this. You will lower the stigma if you have both teachers working with a variety of students. It's super important to collaborate. We do not want a situation where the special educator is joining the class without a clear plan of how to be of assistance to the students. So this needs to be a discussion in advance. When possible, co-teach. Now, co-teaching is a big commitment. I know that. But if you could co-teach one lesson a week, not every lesson, you'd be making such progress. With co-teaching, the message we're sending to our students is that both teachers have parity, that they're equal in the view of the students. And we want to make sure that happens. And if the special educator is never teaching, they're not really viewed as a teacher in that classroom. It may be a pull-out model, where at various points of the day, the special educator takes small groups, maybe from multiple teachers, in order to work intensively on a variety of skills based on their IEP goals. No, we can't pull during PE. I'm sorry. We wish we could. It's not legal. What we do want to do is collaborate with each other to find the right time to pull. And the right time to pull is during independent work, so that they're not missing instruction in that general education class. We do need to pull groups in a way that's meaningful, which means please be patient with your special educator. They are working with many teachers' schedules and with kids that may be all over campus in order to construct meaningful intervention groups. Please work with your special educator, because the focus of these groups is often to pre-teach content that will be covered in your general education classroom, or to reteach content that maybe wasn't learned. And then finally, sometimes it's a fully included setting, which means that we have students who are in the general education setting all day long. The special educator teacher may come in for portions of the day, or they may not. Now, this happens not just with students in the mild moderate range. This happens with all of our students. Sometimes the assignment in a general education class may not be appropriate for that student, in which case we want the teachers to collaborate to come up with a parallel assignment. There's an idea here in Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. It's called the big idea. And what that is when you think about your lesson, what is the one thing that you really need every student to walk away with? What's that big idea that you're trying to convey? Once you've identified the big idea, then you can figure out alternative means for students to gain that learning with different levels of lessons based on their needs. But the work here is to figure out what is that one thing that you want to make sure every student learns today. Let's talk just a little bit about families. Children of parents with low literacy have a 72% chance of being at the lowest reading levels themselves. I think it's super important, guys, that we know this, that when we're thinking about these kids and the families who are trying to support them, they don't have the resources that we have at schools, or that middle or upper class families often have at their ready. So these are the kids that are more likely to get low grades, that are more likely to display behavior problems, have high absentee or repeat school. I want to say something to you regarding students who are struggling with learning and may act out in class. Ask yourself, would you rather be the dumb kid or the bad kid? Any day of the week, they're going to pick the bad kid. When you are seeing those acting out behaviors, oftentimes that's to camouflage that they're struggling with an activity, or they're embarrassed to do an activity in front of their peers. And they may be acting out to escape a task. Take a look at this. This is very special ed. Do you have a headache yet? This is jargon. All educators have their own brand of jargon. You're looking at special education's brand, right? We love to talk in acronyms. What's the problem with that? Language matters. When we're using terms that don't include the parents, we're excluding them from the discussion. Another way to think of this is to think about what the medical model of disability means. In this model, which is a traditional model, we take on the role of a medical professional. We use lots of jargon and technical terms, and we like to know what we need to do with the child rather than ask. Oftentimes, we're telling a family, this is what your child needs, as opposed to starting with a question. What do you think your child needs? The use of jargon falls into this category very easily. It's very, very easy to make a parent or a family member feel displaced, like they don't have a seat at the table when you're using language that excludes them. So what do we do instead? We think about the whole child. We think about not what's wrong within the child, but what supports and structures exist, and how can we modify and make adaptations so that that child, just as they are, can succeed. We're trying to stop thinking about what's wrong with the child, right? And we're looking instead of what are the barriers that may be in place? And how can we help our kids navigate those barriers? The mindset here is collaborative, that these partnerships with families, when we start with asking questions rather than telling them, research demonstrates that these partnerships have benefits to the kids. The kids get better grades. Their attendance goes up, their persistence goes up, their motivation to go to school goes up. What kinds of things can we do with families? We can help forge connections across settings. Do you remember way back at the beginning, I said that students with learning disabilities have a hard time generalizing new learning to novel situations? So let's get them to practice in more than one environment. Let's get more than one person talking about these key ideas with them. They're much more likely to apply it to novel situations when they've had practice in multiple settings. We can learn so much from families who this is their child's. They've known them, intimately in a way that as a teacher we never will. And they know tips and tricks about their kids that we don't. So what kinds of accommodations might a child need? Most educators have a list in their mind of typical accommodations, but what if it's something that would never have occurred to us, right? Maybe something a child is highly motivated by. I worked with a teacher a few years back who had learned from one of her child's families that her favorite activity was brushing her mom's hair. So the reward the teacher used was that she could brush her hair during lunch. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want anyone brushing my hair. That is not a reward I'd be offering in my class. But for this teacher and this child, it worked. Would you ever have thought of that on your own? You can empower families. We were saying that these children who are struggling readers are coming from parents who are struggling readers. Can we provide them with resources, lists of apps, websites, books that they could read? Can we send materials home for practice so that the child and the parent can be learning together? And it helps us really develop consistent methods for addressing behavior. We don't want to call home only when things have gone wrong. We want to be a team so that we're celebrating success in addition to addressing difficulties. All right, getting started. Empathy, guys. Put yourself in their role. Begin with a positive interaction. Make sure your first phone call or email home isn't about a problem. Find out how families prefer to be reached. It's a different world out there. Do they want to be texted? Do they want to be emailed? Do they prefer a voice call? In this era of COVID, it is interesting to me how much I prefer a phone call to a text or an email these days, right? Gather your thoughts in advance. I would recommend having your talking points written out. Use I statements, not you. Set boundaries together. When is it okay to contact each other and when is it not, right? What is your time that's sacred for your teaching job and your teaching tasks? And what is their time that's sacred? What is the time that either because of their employment or their parenting, that's off limits to us? Try to be solutions oriented. If you're calling home with a difficulty, have some ideas of how you may move together forward, but also ask, be open-minded. So we're going to adjourn briefly to a breakout room.